Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Homerton College. Welcome to the politics of displacement, refugee rights, education, and global orders. My name's Simon Woolley. I'm the principal of Homerton College. Occasionally, I'm Lord Simon Woolley. Usually when I'm asking for money, or as yesterday when I was in the chamber. Speaking about extremism and unity and decency. In that chamber, I put on my cloak to speak for those I feel are unheard. But as a principal of Homerton College, one of the things that we're very proud of is supporting our fellows to do international events like this. When they come to me and say they've got an idea, and my first question is, how big? And they say, very big. And this is one of those. I want to begin by thanking the organizers, and not least our key organizer, Dr. Maha, Shuayb, Director, Center for Lebanese Studies at the University of Cambridge. Can we please give a round of applause? One of the reasons why this is important to me personally and to the college is that if any of you know my background, I see myself often as a disciple of Dr. Martin Luther King. You know that King had a dream that we would not be judged by the color of our skin, but by the content of a character. What you may not know is Dr. King also had a plan. And the plan was to inform, to inspire, and to empower. Not to ask for justice, not to beg for justice, but to demand it. And when I see an event like that, I would argue that we're walking in the footsteps of Dr. King and all those heroes and sheroes. Why is this event today important? Well, we all know in many ways that talent, brilliance, creativity is universal. It is in the four corners of the globe. But sadly, opportunity isn't. And as many of you know, when we're looking at refugees and displaced people, that often we look through the prism of safety, of course, shelter, and food. Absolutely imperative. Too often, I would argue that we forget education. We forget education as an international human right. This personally dawned on me in dramatic sense during the Gaza war, because there were students there that had places here at Cambridge who could not get out to fulfill their ambition, to fulfill their right. I was proud of the work that this college did, along with the university, along with some politicians and business leaders like Shireen Hack Corey, who then was the head of the co-op. She was running a £12 billion business. And she came in and gave a talk, and she said, "Simon, what can we do to get the Palestinians out?" And I think she chased David Lammy down at Parliament and said to David Lammy, "What are you going to do?" Eventually, we got those students out. They're in Ireland now, and hopefully they will come here. Look, just one more minute. This is important because identifying those young men and women, those refugees, those displaced people, that it's incumbent upon us to acknowledge their rights, but also to stand up and say, like Martin Luther King, what is our plan to give them the pathway from A to B to success? And when we do that, the world is a key beneficiary of their ideas, of discovery, of their leadership, and hope. Ultimately, when we get this right, this is a recognition of our shared humanity, through the dark sides, but also the bright side. Imagine this for those online and those here today. In some of the biggest conversations that society needs to have right now, we're having them here at Homerton College because of your activism. Thank you all very much. Mel, can I ask you to do the nuts and bolts, please, which we probably should have done first. But this will be the nuts and bolts of fire alarms and stuff.
Thanks, everybody. Apologies to those online. This is really for everyone here on site at Homerton College. So I'm Melanie. I work here at Homerton along with Simon. And really, I'm doing the boring housekeeping, which is to say the porters reassure me that they have tested the fire alarms right now this morning. So if the alarm does go off, it will be a real alarm, in which case, please use the appropriate exits accordingly. Also, if you're trying to find where the loos are, there are toilets if you go to the left and just round the corner, and also if you go to the right down towards the new dining hall. So please do make your choice accordingly. But yeah, just to say, looking forward to an absolutely wonderful day. I'll probably be popping up a bit later to relay some questions from the online chat, but looking forward to a day of really important and inspiring conversation.
Thank you, Mel. Thank you, Lord Simon. Good morning, everyone. Sabah al khair. To those also online, we also have interpretation for those online in Arabic. They just need to press the button. It's really a pleasure to have you here. For those of you who don't know much about the Center for Lebanese Studies, we were actually created during the war, during the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 1982 by Lebanese diaspora living in England, who really wanted to do something about their home country. And this is how the whole idea, they were businessmen, interestingly, but they decided to invest in social sciences, which is also very remarkable. And since then, the idea was that how do we use social sciences to bring about a peace, but also how do you bring justice into Lebanon and into the wider world. It's a pleasure to, it has become an annual event to mark the Refugee Week. And this year it's even more important as we're celebrating the 75th year of the Refugee Convention. So we would hopefully engage with this. Without further delay, I should also first, I always forget to acknowledge the very important people who made this event possible, and I want to do it at the beginning rather than at the end. This has been an amazing collaboration with Homerton College, Melanie, Lester, thank you very much, and our partners for the very long time now, few years, the Real Center at the Faculty of Education, plus the CSWANA Center in Cambridge, a recently set up center that focuses on the CSWANA region. Welcome to everyone. We will move to the first panel, to the welcome, Mezna, Pauline, please, if you can come. Thank you.
Would anybody mind if I took a picture? You don't mind? Thank you very much. Going to be LinkedIn stars. Sorry.
It's okay.
Oh, no, I'll do a special one for you. Thank you. Oh, there we go. I've got two supporters.
Yes, please. I have prepared a very small note to mark the event. We'll just wait. Mezna, would you like a glass of water? Fine, thank you. So Refugee Week is often presented as a celebration of resilience, diversity, and contribution. Those celebrations matter, but Refugee Week must also be a moment of reflection and honesty, a time to ask difficult questions about the world we have created and the futures we are willing to imagine. It's a moment to confront the politics of who gets to be protected, who is heard, and who is left outside the circle of concern and protection. It's also critical that we reflect on the refugee regime we have helped create, the narratives we have constructed around refugees, who we recognize as victims, who we celebrate as heroes, and who is denied even the right to be acknowledged as a victim. Most importantly, we must ask whose responsibility for displacement is obscured, erased, or rendered invisible within these narratives. In the dominant imaginary of displacement, there is rarely a perpetrator and almost never anyone held to account. Our liberal values are remarkably comfortable with us celebrating the existence of a refugee Olympic team as a symbol of success and resilience. We applaud athletes who, despite extraordinary odds, continue to compete. We rarely ask, why do we have to have a refugee team in the Olympics? And we rarely confront what happened in global politics for refugees' number to double or actually tripled in the last 30 years. We have so many states that transform themselves into fortresses, and as a result, we have refugee Olympic teams. In this story, there is inspiration, but almost no politics in the discourse on refugees. Language matters. Refugees are presented as a brand, either victims to be saved or heroes to be admired. The forces that displace them disappear from view. Humanitarian agencies undoubtedly provide vital support, food, shelter, healthcare, education. Yet the millions who spend much of their lives displaced, yet for the millions who spend much of their lives displaced, humanitarianism often manages suffering rather than addressing its causes. People are kept in cycles of dependency, precarity, and charity, while the structures that produce displacement remain largely untouched. As we meet today, we also mark 75 years since the adoption of the 1951 Refugee Convention. The convention emerged from the horrors of genocides and persecution, but it was also shaped by a distinctly European experience. Colonial violence, dispossession, and mass atrocities and genocide has long been inflicted on populations across the global South. But what made the 1951 exceptional and possible was that Europe was forced to confront within its own borders the kind of barbarity it had routinely externalized to others. 75 years later, if we look honestly at the global landscape, we see a deep disjuncture between the universality claimed by convention and the selective way protection is granted in practice. Borders are ever more fortified. Asylum is externalized and outsourced and criminalized. Refugees and migrants are framed as security threats rather than right holders. Crises rather than people entitled to dignity, protection, and justice. At the same time, public discourse is saturated with xenophobia, racialized fear that curiously depoliticize the language of war into crisis, conflict, where the subject is always missing, and where some people on the move are hyper-visible and others are rendered controversial and unspeakable. Crucially, solidarity has become stratified. We have witnessed immense generosity towards some refugees, especially when they are imagined as culturally proximate or politically convenient. Yet we see starkly different reactions to those who are Black, Muslims, or from other countries that are distant and might appear different. Their displacement is often treated as contentious, suspect, or simply too risky to name. Institutions highly condemn racism, while remaining silent about many other forms of racism, like anti-Palestinian racism or Islamophobia. We have seen academics lose their jobs for daring to name genocide or to question humanitarian industries that watch people being shot and butchered while queuing for food to avoid dying from hunger. The selective solidarity undermines the very foundation of any universal human rights project. If justice is conditional, it ceases to be. If justice is conditional, it ceases to be justice. None of this would be possible without the systemic weakening and the structural limitations of the international institutions that were created to uphold protection and solidarity. The UN system itself was marked from the outset by the hegemony of colonial powers whose votes and interests have always counted more than those who are colonized. In such a system, accountability for war, occupation, or climate destruction has always been the exception, not the rule. As authoritarianism rises, as arms races accelerate, and as economic inequalities deepen, this already fragile regime has become even less charitable. Across the humanitarian sector, funding cuts are forcing agencies to scale back programs that millions of displaced people depend on for education, healthcare, protection, and basic survival. At time of record displacement, support of those most affected is being treated as politically expandable. The case of UNRWA is particularly telling. For decades, UNRWA have provided education, healthcare, and social services to millions of Palestinians, yet now it's being forced to shut down. And I'm not going to go into the implications of that for millions of Palestinians who are already under massacres and occupation and all sorts of atrocities. Against this backdrop, I want to suggest that the 75th anniversary of the Refugee Convention should not be simply a celebration of endurance. It should go back to the roots of its promise and move beyond its limits. The convention remains a remarkable achievement, a legal expression of a will to prevent atrocities from happening again. At a time when many governments seek to weaken refugee protections, defending its core principles is essential. But the convention emerged from a particular historical moment. Today, displacement is increasingly shaped by neo-imperialism, occupation, statelessness, climate injustice, economic collapse and inequalities, and double unequal power relationships, and deeply unequal power relations. Millions spend decades in displacement. The average number of years a refugee spends in displacement is 27 years. Many of them don't come back. Rethinking must happen first at the legal and doctrinal level. Defending the convention cannot mean treating it as frozen in 1951 or reducing it to a tool of migration management, where most of the discussion is now focused on. It must be understood as a guarantee of substantive enforceable rights to safety, dignity, and participation. Second, we need to think the architecture around the convention, the humanitarian sector, the agendas of funders, the interests that they serve, and the ways they mirror state priorities. Technical reforms, new protocols, complementary protection, stronger regional instruments may matter procedurally, but they will remain superficial if they are not grounded in a commitment to dismantling the racialized and colonial logics that determines whose mobility is criminalized and whose exile is normalized. At best, current arrangements allow refugees to survive. They rarely allow them to flourish or to experience justice. This leads me to a third, deeper thinking point, the moral and political economy of solidarity itself. Law does not operate in vacuum. Its application is shaped by narratives that cast some refugees as like us and others as threat, by Islamophobia that codes Muslim refugees as inherently suspect, and the policing of Palestinian solidarity that makes it professionally dangerous even to acknowledge Palestinian displacement and loss. When anti-racism campaigns are carefully ring-fenced to exclude certain refugees, we are not just witnessing hypocrisy, we are witnessing the production of a hierarchy of racism. I confess that neither political science, and no disrespect for political scientists here, nor economics were my favorite field, yet we have no choice but to name and to use politics and economics here. We must replace a politics of charity which feeds exclusion, impunity in the absence of accountability, with the politics of rights, but more of liberation. From Epstein to Netanyahu to Trump to Putin to the CEOs of, the list goes on, of men, particularly white men, of corporate profiting from war, surveillance. We are confronting a world where technologies, including AI, help decide who lives, who dies, and who is displaced, and no one is held accountable for any of this. If we don't repair the house that is in the UN system, our hope is limited. Only then we can transform from charity to emancipation. If we're serious about justice, we can't just separate displacement from its causes. We must move from the politics of charity to politics of rights, solidarities, and shared responsibilities. This means strengthening pathways for participation, representation, and meaningful inclusion so that displaced communities shape the policies and institutions that govern their life. Now, this brings me to academia and to education. Later today, we'll discuss this more fully, but in my own field of education, and we're publishing a book on this, academics have often been complicit in a liberal, depoliticized machinery of education in emergencies, education in conflict, and peace education. The scale of destruction in Gaza has exposed and pushed us all to kind of grapple with how we were using these spaces as sites for fieldwork and publications. But then when we really needed to show solidarity, but it became too risky, we were kind of like hesitant. Do we move or do we not? Our professional groups also didn't know what to do because there's sites for promoting our careers, not for making and we were actually saying, is this a space where we make a political stand or show solidarity with the communities where we basically built our livelihood and careers on? Our academic ethics have too often become reduced to forms to be filled and approved by committees or journals. Once approved, research becomes ethical by procedure, even when it sits uneasily with what we see every day, whether on our TV or when we go to the field. The good news is that many important initiatives are emerging. So the picture is not really hopeless. Actually, there has been, despite the atrocities we've seen in Gaza, this really prompted many people to really mobilize, and some of them really at a very high cost. As the humanitarian regime struggles, new calls for radically different futures are gaining ground. Academics are mobilizing. Some have lost jobs and fundings, others will never be tenured, but they will continue to organize. Change can only come through collective work and coalitions that refuse the simple north-south divide, recognizing there's only one planet that our futures are entangled. These questions are particularly acute in education. For education, enforced displacement has been celebrated as a humanitarian success. Access has expanded, funding has increased, at least 2 years ago, until new programs have proliferated. But the central question cannot only be how to get displaced children into schools. We must also ask what kind of education is being offered, who defines its purpose, who produces the knowledge that shapes policies, who voices are heard, and what futures are enabled or foreclosed by current approaches. The title of today's conference, The Politics of Displacement, Refugee Rights, Education, and the Global Orders, reflect precisely this challenge. At a moment when humanitarianism resources are shrinking and hostility towards refugees is growing, we need more than better programs. We need new ideas, new coalitions, and greater intellectual courage. I want to finish by something that I do sometimes with my son as I'm trying to push him to go to school very early in the morning. We listen to meditation. I know it's cheesy and all of this, but anything that can get him out. And one point that it stopped him, which I thought like, wow, that was remarkable. And there was a sentence that this person is saying, I choose courage rather than comfort. And I think that's, and for my son, that stopped him. I thought like, wow, okay, wow, that's indeed, it's difficult to choose courage than comfort. And I think at a moment like this, we really have to choose courage than comfort. When you think of the children who had their limbs amputated without anesthetic, or pregnant women who had C-section without anesthetic, when we think of all the millions of refugees who have to keep going despite everything, they don't have any comfort, unfortunately. We have comfort. We're privileged enough to have some form of comfort. So we need to choose courage to push beyond these boundaries. Thank you very much, and sorry for talking too long. Pauline?
Maha, that was so powerful, and I absolutely can't follow that in the slightest, but thank you for setting the scene for today so well. I just want to first start by acknowledging the wonderful poster for this event. I think it really sums up really well what the issues are. That is also so powerful. I think it was a colleague at Centre for Lebanese Studies who designed it, isn't it? Was it? Okay, so thank you for that. Looking at the title and just thinking, we've had a couple of other events this week, and the word that comes to my mind is disruption. So I actually wondered whether we should have called it the politics of disruption rather than the politics of displacement. So on Monday, we had an event with Professor Yusuf Said and other colleagues with the University of the Western Cape, looking at issues around ethical collaborations and partnerships. And I think for us, this collaboration and partnership with the Centre for Lebanese Studies has been so important over the last few years, not just those nice comfort areas of collaboration, but also the questioning, the criticisms, the sort of really sort of holding us to account and thinking about how we within the faculty need to, and the university can and need to do things differently. So that's one form of disruption I think that we collectively benefit from. At the event on Monday, and as some of you in the audience know better than me, on Tuesday it was Youth Day in South Africa, recognising the uprising in Soweto 50 years ago, when students were at the forefront of disruption in relation to apartheid. And obviously it took many more years to see the end of apartheid, but one of the things that helped to see the end of apartheid was global disruption and global movements. On Tuesday, there was an event with Cambridge Africa, which was very much an African-led event, had amazing speakers, and very much also thinking and putting Cambridge on the spot critically about what we mean by collaborations and what we need to see in terms of African-led growth and development, but in the context of a huge debt crisis. So I think this is sort of relatively invisible at the moment. It's not getting attention. We now remember what happened in the 1980s when there was a huge debt crisis, and the way that totally disrupted. Disrupted is maybe not even strong enough word. Yet we're now in an era where, as Maha, you said, it's end of aid as we knew it. We are in a different world of how those relationships will work, how those colonial relationships that existed through the aid structures are now going to be different. But what form of disruption can we see and do we need to see? And then coming to the sort of focus of today around displacement and refugees, and fully taking your points, Maha, about how these words are used so loosely in a way. I mean, and when it's sort of real people's lives and lived realities. And the work that we've done together with the Centre for Lebanese Studies on Palestine, which certainly I've sort of learned a lot from, and working in collaboration with UNRWA at a time when they've been so under threat, and some of the challenges around how one collaborates on that when you're working with an organisation like UNRWA that faces these huge challenges, but at the same time really wanting to make sure that we're documenting the effects of genocide on schooling, on the lives of these children and young people whose futures are really being affected. And as many of you know, the word scholasticide, that means that it's a deliberate attack on education systems that is not just stopping the individual's schooling, but actually is to do with a stopping of the memory, the history, the futures. And I mean, it's just sort of impossible to imagine. And then thinking about the word displacement and why I was sort of thinking it just seems a bit of a euphemism in some ways, because it is to do with people's daily lives being disrupted. Every single person in Gaza has been displaced or disrupted, not just once, but many, many times. In Lebanon, I know, Maha, similarly, you know, in so many contexts, we're seeing that people's lives are being disrupted. And it's like, okay, you're being evacuated and you need to leave. Where do you leave to? What options do you have? What can you take with you when you've got very little time? And what you hear the stories of time and again is when people's lives are being disrupted, the things that they're taking with them are their school papers to make sure that they continue with their education. Often they have very little time to decide what they're going to take and not actually the capacity to carry that much. And, you know, for some of us, this can seem, you know, we can get emotional about it, but it's not actually affecting us directly. And I know that for many in the rooms, this is a lived reality. And I think that's something we should be very aware of today throughout these discussions, that it's not something abstract, it's not an academic discussion. So coming back to earlier, Simon called you an activist, Maha. I'd call you an academic activist, or I don't know how you'd want to label yourself, but I think it's so important to bring together the academic and the activism, that this isn't just something abstract that we're talking about, but actually how it's really affecting people's lives. Finally, I just sort of was also reflecting on where we go from here. So we've seen, you know, global movements can have an effect. Frankly, at the moment, I have very little or no faith in democracy in some of what might consider themselves to be the most powerful countries in the world. They're certainly not powerful, and nor are they having any desired effect. So I think what I'd quite like from today is to think about what do we do in terms of a global movement to see something where we're moving, and from a sort of political point of view, to see a disruption in a way that we need. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Mezna Qato. I'm here with my hat as director of the Center for Southwest Asian and North African Studies, which is a very nascent new initiative that began sort of coming into being in 2024 and was more formally established within the University of Cambridge in 2025. And it was very, in part at least, very much sparked and by the escalating situation within the region, but also within a conversation, an intensified and growing coalition or coalescence of conversations amongst the many scholars of the region across this university who wanted to come together to think collaboratively and with vigor and with principle around what their relationship as scholars of Southwest Asia and North Africa should be to questions like displacement, like mass violence, like genocide, and to do so in ways that also do not divorce these centers of intellectual thought within the global North from the scholars that also produce knowledge across the global South, and particularly from the region, at least in terms of the remit of our center. So the idea here too is that there are so many scholars across the region who also think about the sets of questions that we're working and thinking through today, and how do we connect with them, how do we work alongside them, and how do we collaborate with them to sort of become more than the sum of parts. And this, you know, at the center, this can become, you know, this is also a hub for scholars within this university to think about how we can do that in real logistical kind of concrete ways. But to really kind of, I'll be really short, but to really say in this space that this conversation around displacement happens across the region in all sorts of intellectual ways that exist in excess of the university. I was just there. I was, you know, in the region And the number of collectives, young people gathering, university spaces, that sometimes are repressive, but then there's pockets of oxygen that are produced by young people gathering with their professors. There are all sorts of initiatives that are thinking carefully and really rigorously and very, very creatively about how to approach the challenges they themselves face, often as refugees, but also their neighbors, their friends, their loved ones. And so, it's also important for us in this room to not see ourselves as somehow producing something that trickles down elsewhere or in the region. And at the same time, to understand that this can also be a breathing space under conditions where so many refugees are silenced and forced to kind of toe lines that they may be uncomfortable with, but need to do in order to survive. So to create a kind of space for them as well to think alongside us is really crucial. And I hope that the center and in collaboration with the Real Center and CLS can be that space, and that these are the kinds of folks and colleagues of ours who can be refugees themselves, who are on the run at the moment, across, for me at least, across the region. Sudanese scholars that I've been in touch with, all sorts of folks that think about these questions are brought into the room in some way as well, even if it is by citation and invocation for now. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you. And now we will, unfortunately, Professor and Pro-Vice Chancellor Bashkar hasn't been able to be with us, but he recorded a video, which we will screen now. Thank you very much, Ms. Pauline.
I wanted to say a few words before the start of what looks like a very rich program in such an important topic. I want to start by saying something. Good morning or good afternoon, wherever you're joining us from today. My name is Bhaskar Veera, and I'm the Pro-Vice Chancellor for Education at the University of Cambridge. It's a genuine privilege to welcome you to this Refugee Week event, organized in partnership with the Lebanese Studies program here at Cambridge. I'm sorry that I couldn't be there in person, but I wanted to say a few words before the start of what looks like a very rich program in such an important topic. I want to start by saying something simple. We are very glad you are here. Whether you're a researcher, a student, a practitioner, or someone with your own experience of displacement, your presence at an event like this really matters. And the conversations you will have today matter too. I'm particularly proud to be opening this event at a moment when the University of Cambridge has taken an important step forward. We are now a University of Sanctuary. That status carries real meaning for us. It is our public commitment that this university is a place of welcome for people who have been forced to leave their homes, their countries, and so much of what they love. It means we want to open our doors more widely to students, to researchers, to colleagues who carry with them the experience of displacement. And I want to be honest, we know that a title alone is not enough. What matters is what we do with it. The University of Sanctuary status is a beginning, not an end. It's a promise we intend to keep and to build on as we progress this work as a collegiate university. We also know that this work, research and education on refugees and forced migration, has never been more important. The world is not moving in an easy direction right now. Across many countries, the language around refugees has become harder, colder, less humane. Borders are tightening. People who have already lost so much are being asked to justify their very presence. In that climate, universities have a responsibility. We must be places where evidence matters, where we ask difficult questions and sit with uncomfortable answers. The work being done here at Cambridge, across our research centers and teaching programs, contributes to that. It helps us to understand the real complexity of forced migration, and it reminds us that behind every statistic is a person, a family, a story. I also want to approach our role in this complex geopolitical world with humility and in a spirit of collaboration and partnership. We can achieve so much more by acting together, by working with those who share our values, and most importantly, by co-producing our responses with those who are most directly impacted by war, conflict, and persecution. We need to listen, and this is why your presence matters. So as we mark Refugee Week 2026, I hope today's event is both thought-provoking and hopeful. I hope it deepens connections between disciplines, between institutions, and between people. And I hope it reminds all of us why this work is worth doing. Thank you to everyone who has made this event possible, and thank you genuinely to those of you who bring your expertise, your commitment, and in some cases, your own lived experience to these conversations. I wish you a wonderful event, and I look forward to hearing about its outcomes.
Thank you. I'm delighted to welcome our keynote speaker, Professor Michelle Pace, who came from the other part, yes, from Oxford. And she had to get through the reform protest yesterday in Oxford station. So thank you for making it despite everything. Professor Pace is an internationally recognized scholar of Europe, Middle East relations, democracy studies, migration, and displacement. She is a professor in global studies and currently visiting academic fellow at the Refugee Studies Center, Oxford, Department of International Development. Over almost 3 decades, her work has examined the intersection of governance, bordering politics, political violence, legitimacy, and the politics of belonging across Europe, the Mediterranean, and the Middle East. Combining critical theoretical perspectives with extensive field-based research, she has written widely on EU-Palestine relations, EU democracy participation, emotions in international relations, and I look forward to hearing about that, refugee integration, and the lived experiences of communities affected by displacement and protracted conflict. And if you haven't read her book, you should read her book, Unwelcome to Denmark, The Paradigm Shift and Refugee Integration, which has been published last year, which, I mean, if you know much about what's happening now in England, Denmark is seen as one of the models to be copied in terms of how do you deter refugees. I'm not going to go further into your bio. You can, by the way, there's a QR code. If you scan it, you can get access to all the speakers' bios. Michelle, over to you.
Thank you very much, Maha, for the generous introduction, and thank you to all the organizers for inviting me to participate in this very important conference. It is truly a pleasure and a privilege to join colleagues from a range of disciplines and professional backgrounds who share a true commitment to understanding displacement, refugee rights, education, and the changing global order. The themes of this conference could hardly be more timely.
Something did go wrong. Many things are going wrong.
We meet at a moment in which migration has become one of the defining political questions of our age. At the same time, migration itself is not the only issue at stake. Across the UK, Europe, and beyond, debates about migration increasingly function as debates about identity, sovereignty, democracy, security, and belonging. Migration has become a prism through which wider social anxieties are expressed and political futures imagined. What is striking, however, is that we live in a paradoxical moment. Never before have we possess such extensive empirical knowledge about migration, refugee experiences, integration, labor market participation, and the educational trajectories of displaced populations. However, never before has migration been discussed so persistently through narratives of fear, misinformation, disinformation, and moral panic. This paradox raises a set of fundamental questions for us all. If we know more about migration than ever before, why is it that exclusionary narratives continue to dominate political debates? Why do myths concerning migrants and refugees continue to circulate despite decades of research challenging simplistic assumptions about welfare dependency, crime, integration, social cohesion, and cultural incompatibility? And what does this tell us not only about migration politics, but also about the contemporary condition of democracy itself? Today, I would like to suggest that migration is not simply a policy issue to be managed, nor is it merely a social phenomena to be measured. Rather, I would like to argue that migration has become one of the principal terrains through which contemporary societies negotiate questions of membership, of belonging, of political authority, and the future. My argument is therefore a very simple one. The greatest challenge confronting migration studies today is not a lack of evidence about migration. Rather, it is the growing political struggle over who has the authority to define reality, belonging, and the future. In other words, what kind of society we want ours to be. For this reason, I would like to organize my reflections today around three interconnected themes: facts, fear, and futures, with a focus on uncertainty as a bridging concept. So first, I wish to reflect on the contemporary crisis of evidence and public knowledge. Second, I examine how fear has become institutionalized through contemporary forms of migration governance and bordering. And third, I consider what alternative politics of belonging might look like in an increasingly fractured global order. Ultimately, I would like to argue that the future of migration studies is inseparable from the future of democracy itself. So let me begin with facts. Recent debates within migration studies have raised important questions about the future direction of the field itself. Some scholars have suggested that critical migration studies risks becoming trapped in a reactive posture, continually correcting misconceptions while remaining confined by the political agendas it seeks to critique. Others have called for a renewed intellectual agenda, capable of connecting migration to wider questions concerning inequality, race, coloniality, citizenship, and democracy. Now, these debates are important because they invite us to consider and reconsider a very basic assumption inherent in them. What if migration is not the primary phenomena requiring explanation? What if migration is instead a lens through which broader transformations in the political order become visible? When we examine migration closely, we encounter questions that extend far beyond migration itself. We encounter questions about global inequalities, about colonial histories, about citizenship, about labor markets, about race and belonging, and also about democracy. So therefore, migration reveals something fundamental about the societies that seek to govern it. This is particularly important because many of the dominant narratives shaping contemporary public debates remain remarkably resistant to evidence. Across the UK, Europe, and elsewhere, political discussions frequently portray migrants and refugees as either burdens or threats to the welfare systems, cultural cohesion, public security, and national identity. And still, decades of scholarship demonstrate that such claims are often partial, selective, or unsupported by available evidence. This does not mean that migration is without challenges, nor does it mean that societies do not face difficult questions concerning resources, integration, or social change. Rather, it means that political debates frequently operate according to logics that cannot be fully explained through evidence alone. My argument is thus that yes, facts matter, but facts rarely speak for themselves. evidence enters political arenas already shaped by narratives, by emotions, by historical memories and power relations. This is one reason why migration politics cannot be understood solely through statistics or policy analysis. We must also examine the stories societies tell about themselves, about who belongs, who does not belong, who is imagined as contributing to the nation, who is imagined as threatening it. So these questions bring us directly to the role of fear. If facts alone cannot explain contemporary migration politics, we must ask what other forces are at work. One answer lies in the political production of fear. Fear in this context should not be understood merely as an individual emotion. Rather, fear functions as a political technology. It organizes perceptions, it structures policy practices and priorities, it shapes public imagination, and helps define the boundaries of belonging. So if we take some steps back, we observe that over the past 2 decades, since 9/11 and the so-called War on Terror, the Mohammed cartoons crisis, the 2007-8 economic crisis, the so-called European refugee crisis, migration has increasingly been framed through the language of security, of control, of crisis, of emergency, in other words, through securitization discourses. The border has become one of the most visible symbols of this transformation. Nevertheless, borders today extend far beyond territorial frontiers. They increasingly operate through legal categories, temporary protection, for example, welfare systems, educational institutions, labor markets, and everyday practices of inclusion and exclusion. Therefore, the border is no longer simply a line on a map. It has become a broader mechanism through which membership is differentiated and rights distributed. In turn, to understand this development, we must situate contemporary migration governance within longer historical trajectories. The movement of people, resources, labor, and capital has always been embedded within unequal relations of power. Post-colonial scholars have long reminded us that contemporary global inequalities cannot be separated from colonial histories. As scholars such as Edward Said and Frantz Fanon and others have argued, contemporary political orders continue to bear the imprint of these histories. This insight is particularly important when examining contemporary UK, European, and global migration politics. For instance, migration is often represented as an external pressure on these countries, and something that is confronting these countries from the outside. Yet, such representations obscure the historical entanglements, for instance, between the UK and European states themselves and how they have been constituted. Colonial expansion, imperial governance, economic extractions, and global inequalities are not external to contemporary migration debates. They are part of the conditions that make such debates possible. From this perspective, migration governance becomes more than a response to human mobility. It becomes a site through which historical hierarchies are reproduced, challenged, and renegotiated. This is where the concept of border imperialism becomes useful. Border imperialism directs our attention to the ways in which borders function, not merely as instruments of territorial control, but as mechanisms through which mobility, rights, and belonging are differentially organized. The issue is therefore not simply who crosses borders. The issue is whose mobility is facilitated, whose mobility is restricted, and whose presence is rendered conditional. Hence, contemporary bordering practices increasingly operate far beyond territorial borders themselves. Externalization agreements, deterrence measures, temporary protection regimes, deportability, and differentiated access to rights, as already was mentioned by Maha, all reflect broader efforts to govern mobility at a distance. These developments are visible not only in the UK and Europe, but also in North America, across the Mediterranean, and in relations with neighboring regions. Within national context, they are visible in countries such as Denmark, which, as mentioned, I have studied particularly close, and which has often functioned as an important policy laboratory for wider European developments. So let us take a moment to ask, why are narratives of fear proving so politically effective at this historical moment? One answer is uncertainty. And here I'm not referring to uncertainty experienced by refugees and migrants, although of course we all appreciate that. I am referring to uncertainty experienced by host societies themselves. These economic uncertainties, geopolitical uncertainties, the war that the US and Israel has imposed not only on Iran, Lebanon, and Gaza, but even beyond in the region, planetary and climate uncertainty, democratic uncertainty, and above all, ontological uncertainty. In other words, migration becomes politically salient, not simply because people move across borders, but because mobility offers a visible and politically convenient object onto which wider societal anxieties can be projected. In periods characterized by uncertainty, migration often comes to symbolize concerns that originate elsewhere. As I mentioned, concerns about economic change, geopolitical instability, democratic fragility, cultural transformation, and an increasingly unpredictable future. But societal anxieties do not automatically become migration policies. They must first be translated into political narratives that render uncertainty governable. This is where political discourse performs some of its most important work. Faced with complex and often uncontrollable challenges, governments frequently seek to reassure publics by framing migration through the language of safety, control, protection, and national resilience. Such narratives do not simply describe reality. They help produce particular understandings of who belongs, who poses a risk, who should bear the burden of uncertainty. It is precisely at this point that broader anxieties become embedded within migration governance itself. Now, back in 2019, Denmark declared that parts of Syria, including Damascus and surrounding regions, could be considered sufficiently safe for refugees to be returned to. This illustrates a broader transformation occurring within contemporary migration governance. The significance of such policies extends beyond the specific national context in which they emerge. What is particularly revealing is the political work performed by the language of safety itself. Traditionally, concepts such as safety and protection occupied a central place within refugee protection frameworks, especially the Convention. They reflected commitments to safeguarding individuals fleeing persecution, violence, and displacement. Increasingly, however, the language of safety appears alongside practices of deterrence, of containment, conditionality, and return. Safety becomes less a condition experienced by refugees themselves and more a category administered by states. So this raises important questions. Safe for whom? Who determines safety? On what grounds? And whose experiences count when such determinations are made? These questions reveal that contemporary migration governance is not only concerned with managing mobility, it is also concerned with managing uncertainty. Indeed, uncertainty may be one of the defining political conditions of our contemporary moment. Across many societies, uncertainty has become a pervasive feature of everyday life. We see it in economic precarity, we see it in geopolitical conflicts, we see it in climate disruptions, we see it in the erosion of trust in most institutions, but particularly in political institutions. We see it in growing anxieties concerning social change and democratic futures. Migration then often becomes entangled with these broader uncertainties. Importantly, migrants do not create these uncertainties. Yet migration frequently becomes one of the most visible sites through which they are expressed. In this sense, migration politics often tells us less about migration itself than about the anxieties that society is debating it. The figure of the migrant becomes a vessel into which wider fears are projected. The border becomes a symbolic space where societies attempt to reassert control in conditions that appear increasingly uncertain and unpredictable. So this helps explain why the language of control has become so politically powerful, because control promises certainty, it promises order, and it promises security. Yet the pursuit of certainty through exclusion frequently generates new forms of insecurity and inequality. Hence, this is one of the central paradoxes of contemporary migration governance. Policies that are being justified in the name of security often deepen social divisions. Policies that are being justified in the name of cohesion frequently undermine inclusion. And policies that are being justified in the name of protection may weaken the very institutions of protection upon which democratic societies depend. So, viewed from this perspective, I would argue that contemporary bordering practices are not simply responses to migration. They are responses to uncertainty. Borders, debordering, rebordering, and other bordering practices become political technologies through which governments seek to demonstrate authority, responsiveness, and control in a world characterized by complexity and interdependence. So the challenge of critical migration scholars, therefore, is not simply to analyze migration policies. It is to understand how uncertainty itself becomes governed, how particular fears become amplified, how some futures become imaginable and others are rendered impossible, and importantly, how alternative political imaginaries might emerge. Which brings me to my third F, the question of futures. At this point, I guess it would be easy to conclude with a familiar diagnosis of crisis. Indeed, there is no shortage of evidence suggesting that exclusionary politics has become increasingly influential across many democratic societies. Far-right, radical right, right populist, nationalist, and other conservative parties have expanded their electoral reach. Restrictive migration policies has become very normalized. Meta Fredrickson initially, even while she was in opposition, declared a zero asylum policy, and here we are today. The language of deterrence has entered mainstream political discourse, and narratives of crisis continue to shape public understandings of migration. However, diagnosis alone is not sufficient in itself. If critical migration studies are to remain intellectually and politically relevant, they must do more than document exclusion. They must also help us think critically about alternative futures. The question increasingly posed by practitioners, educators, civil society organizations, international organizations, refugee advocates, and policymakers, but particularly young people across societies globally, is therefore truly an understandable one. What can we do? What can be done? How do we respond to highly organized political actors whose narratives often appear to dominate public debate? How can refugee rights be defended in increasingly hostile political environments? How can democratic commitments be sustained when fear appears politically more effective than evidence? We have to acknowledge that these are truly difficult questions, and there are no simple answers. However, I would like to suggest that one of the most important contributions of critical migration scholarship is to remind us that contemporary developments are neither inevitable nor uncontested. Political imaginaries are never fixed. Borders themselves are political constructions. The categories through which belonging is organized are historically contingent rather than natural. What has been constructed can also be reconstructed. What has been normalized can be challenged. And what appears politically inevitable today may look very different tomorrow. For this reason, alternative politics of belonging begin not with policy instruments, but with our political imagination. They begin by asking different questions. So rather than asking how migration can be controlled, we might ask how democratic societies can be strengthened, especially through inclusion. Rather than asking how mobility can be prevented, we might ask how rights can be protected. Rather than asking who threatens the nation, we might ask what forms of community are possible in an interconnected world. Such questions do not ignore complexity, nor do they deny the existence of social tensions or political disagreements. Rather, they shift the terms of the debate. They invite us to imagine belonging as something more expansive than exclusion and more democratic than fear. And this brings me back to where I began, and I'm soon going to close. I suggested at the outset that migration is not simply a policy issue to be managed, nor is it merely a social phenomena to be measured. It is one of the principal terrains through which contemporary societies negotiate questions of democracy, of belonging, of authority, and the future. For this reason, the stakes of contemporary migration debates extend far beyond migration itself. The question is not only how societies respond to displacement. The question is also what kinds of political communities we wish to become. Will uncertainty lead us towards increasingly exclusionary forms of politics, in which borders become ever more central to defining who counts and who does not? Or might uncertainty also create opportunities to imagine new forms of solidarity, responsibility, and democratic belonging? None of us can know with certainty what the future will bring, but we do know that the futures we inhabit are shaped by the political choices we make in the present. This is why the work undertaken by scholars, by educators, by practitioners, civil society organizations, and displaced communities themselves remain so crucial. Education, in particular, occupies a vital place within this broader landscape. Education is not only about transmitting knowledge. It is about cultivating critical thinking, democratic engagement, and the capacity to imagine alternative futures. At a moment when fear often travels faster than evidence, these capacities matter more than ever. The challenge for us, therefore, is not simply to produce better knowledge about migration. It is also to defend the democratic spaces within which knowledge can inform public life, to challenge narratives that reduce complex human experiences to categories of threat, and to continue imagining forms of belonging that are grounded in dignity, inequality, and shared humanity. If migration has become one of the defining questions of our age, then how we respond to migration may tell future generations a great deal about who we were, what we feared, and what kind of future we chose to build. Thank you.